The descent into Cold War began shortly after the end of the Second World War. If we can return our vision to those Soviet and American forces standing on the banks of the River Elbe, we see a continent split in half and two sides struggling to envisage together what post-war Europe would look like. Through a series of agreements, the United States and the Soviet Union, with Great Britain often acting as an interlocutor, felt they had come to a sort of uneasy agreement about who would have influence in what places, as well as the processes that would govern the political settlements in Eastern Europe. Stalin, however, and the Soviet leadership were very reluctant to see the possibility of any unfriendly governments arise on their borders, especially after the searing experiences of the First and Second World War. And as a result, they helped to rig elections in Poland and elsewhere, including Czechoslovakia, that very much concerned American and other Western audiences. Soon after, the Soviet Union also delayed the removal of its forces from oil-rich Iran, and a Soviet spy ring was uncovered in Canada, which showed that under Stalin's guidance, the Soviet Union had been industriously seeking more information about the secret American wartime effort to build the atomic bomb, the Manhattan Project. By 1946, Stalin delivered a speech using Marxist terminology to describe the inevitability of war between the communists and the, quote, imperialist worlds. And Winston Churchill, only months later, described a, quote, iron curtain descending over Eastern Europe in a speech in Fulton, Missouri. At this time, the United States began to consider how it would respond to the worsening of relations with the Soviet Union, which audiences recognized was, along with the United States, emerging as one of two superpowers that would define and perhaps even dictate the terms of the post-war settlement. The first occasion upon which the United States sought to exert its influence in order to forestall the coming to power of a communist government in Europe was against the backdrop of the Greek Civil War. And it was on this occasion that the United States began to speak in terms of containment. Truman pledged $400 million to Greece and Turkey in order to help prop up their governments who were fighting off communist insurrectionists. And soon after, under the stewardship of Secretary of State George Marshall, one of the victorious generals of the Second World War, the United States developed what came to be known as the Marshall Plan, putting aside $12 billion for the reconstruction of Western Europe, with the idea of supporting governments there so that communist regimes would not come to power there as well. However, the terms of the Marshall Plan were set up explicitly in order to discourage the Soviets and those regimes under their protection in Eastern Europe from accepting its terms. And many historians, in retrospect, identify this as the first shot of the Cold War. Now, what did containment mean? Containment was the brainchild of George Frost Kennan, who was a career diplomat in the U.S. Foreign Service who had served in the Moscow embassy when it was reconstituted in the 1930s, and whose views of the Soviet Union were deeply affected by his experience of Stalin's purges at this time. He then served in the Berlin embassy during the Second World War, eventually becoming a hostage of Nazi Germany, before returning to Moscow as a member of an analyst with the embassy there. From Moscow, he had a first row seat, if you will, from which to witness the deteriorating relations between the two wartime allies. And he began to develop what he saw as a strategy to deal with Soviet expansionism. Kennan described this strategy as containment, and it flowed from a worldview or an outlook on foreign affairs that he had developed in reaction against what he saw as traditional American values, in particular what he called a legalistic moralism that he thought pervaded America's relations with the wider world, and which was perhaps exemplified by Woodrow Wilson's attempts to encourage self-determination and collective security under the auspices of the League of Nations. In contrast to this, Kennan set out what he described as a realist conception of international relations. And through this realist lens, he saw the Soviet Union not as necessarily primarily communist, but rather as security anxious, as insecure in light of its geographical position in the middle of Eurasia, but also as the subject of 2 invasions in the past 50 years. He saw, therefore, the Soviet response of trying to expand into Eastern Europe as a natural extension of their geopolitical situation. Communism, to the extent it was important in his eyes, was to rationalize what he saw as a siege mentality. Soviet leaders in this view were therefore paranoid and therefore untrustworthy, and there needed to be the development by the United States of a third option, one between victory and defeat, between isolationism and intervention. And he defined this option as containment, to contain the Soviet Union for the foreseeable future by means of military alliances and active diplomacy. However, containment over the course of the Cold War would come to be deeply controversial. As you can imagine, this term can be interpreted a number of ways. First of all, what is its scope? Should containment be confined solely to the European continent, or was it in fact applicable to the entire world? Secondly, what means should be chosen to pursue this strategy? Should force, military force, be prioritized, or instead diplomacy? 2 quotations to quickly sum up containment as it was understood at the time. The first in Harry Truman's speech on the occasion when he enunciated what came to be called the Truman Doctrine. The president declared, quote, "It must be the policy of the United States to support free people who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures." This really putting a final nail in the coffin of American isolationism. And second, Kennan himself in his writings declaring that the United States policy toward the Soviet Union must be that of a long-term, patient, but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. Now, in order to pursue containment, the United States began to establish what historians have come to call the national security state. And many of the federal institutions that have come to define our foreign policy were in fact founded in this very eventful era. The National Security Act of 1947 authorized the establishment of the Department of Defense, the National Security Council to advise the President on foreign policy and security matters, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which would bring together the heads of the various armed services to give counsel when required, and finally the Central Intelligence Agency, which would mark the first time that the United States would field a peacetime intelligence apparatus. In 1958, this militarization of containment found its fullest expression in a document drawn up by Paul Nitze, NSC 68, which called for, quote, "a policy of calculated and gradual coercion." And this seemed to fit with the tenor of the times. In 1949, Stalin authorized a blockade of the city of Berlin, cutting off land routes to the former German capital. And in response, the United States and its Western allies put together an impromptu and, in fact, incredible airlift to send hundreds of flights per day into the airport surrounding Berlin in order to feed the population there and provide them with medical supplies and all other necessities purely through the air. And in time, Stalin gave up on his blockade, but the United States and its allies, recognizing that some sort of settlement over Berlin and Germany more generally was unlikely, backed the creation of the Federal Republic of Germany, also known as West Germany, with Bonn as its capital. This was also the time when the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, as well as the Warsaw Pact, were put together, along with similar American alliance structures in Southeast Asia and Central Asia, SEATO and CENTO. The last element of this worsening of relations between the Soviet Union and the United States during this period of descent into Cold War was in 1949 the Soviet test of its first nuclear weapon, and then in 1952 the first explosion of a thermonuclear weapon by the United States in the South Pacific. And if you will watch the following video clip, you'll get a sense of the scale of the explosion. I don't know if I need to show this or not. Yeah, go. Good deal. Okay. So these events, these personalities, and these ideas give us a couple of concepts with which to understand the longue durée of the Cold War. The first being, of course, containment and its various permutations. The second, deterrence, and in particular nuclear deterrence, which was the idea that with the development of thermonuclear weapons in particular, but also more advanced means of delivery, neither side could risk a nuclear war and nuclear weapons, instead of permitting one side to prevail in a contest, would instead serve best to deter conflict between two powers. The third concept is détente, again, the relaxation of tensions, which the two sides would use on various occasions in attempts to transcend the Cold War and achieve other goals. And finally, the place of democracy, international institutions, and human rights in America's Cold War. Three mainstays of American foreign policy, both before, during, and after the Cold War, that fit somewhat uneasily in a militarized concept of containment. So the final chapter of this descent into the Cold War was the fall of China in 1949, when Mao Zedong's communist forces finally prevailed over the nationalist forces of Chiang Kai-shek, who then fled to the island of Taiwan to continue the struggle. And this led to a period of intense finger-pointing in Washington, D.C. The U.S. Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, was accused of, quote, losing China, and it became very much an era of anti-communism and fear, especially among Democratic politicians, that they must seem tough on communism. Shortly after, to add to what seemed, at least from the American perspective, to be a series of communist blows against the free world, was the Korean War, which started off in 1950. And to give you a sense of the context and the sense of alarm in Washington, in February 1950 was the official signing of the Sino-Soviet Mutual Defense Pact, which cemented the alliance between the two communist giants. Only 5 months later, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel to lay siege to Seoul and Incheon in South Korea. The United States was able to orchestrate a UN Security Council resolution authorizing a UN police action against the North Korean invasion. This was done because the Soviets were absent at the time. And the United States found itself in a 3-war year in Korea against North Korea, as well as their Chinese backers.